Well, one, I want to just start real quick with Sorkin. You brought him up earlier, and we'll get into what the credit card companies are saying in a moment here. But Sorkin sort of was the driving force, I would say, behind this concept of using MCC codes or creating a special MCC code for gun retailers. Back in 2018, he did a whole story. He did stories about how some of the mass shooters had used credit cards to finance some of their gun purchases, and that this was a way. In his explaining of it, the desire seems to be to try and track patterns of gun purchasing that could indicate somebody is about to commit a mass shooting. That's if you read his pieces. And by the way, we invited him on the show, reached out to the New York Times to see if he'd come on, and he declined to do that. Unfortunately, I'd still be happy to talk to him because I'm very interested in as we'll get into, the logic behind a lot of this stuff and how this plan is supposed to work. But the concept here is supposed to be that you can identify some kind of pattern in gun purchasing that would create a red flag, similar to how the banks report potential fraud in the financial system to law enforcement. And so that was the idea behind creating this MCC code. Now, I guess the first question there is so MCC codes, to your understanding, they don't allow the banks or credit card companies to see individual items purchased, just that
Correct.
The person was shopping at a particular kind of store, right?
That's exactly right. All the code tells someone in the payment processing system is the type of store where the transaction is taking place. Nobody can see inside the basket at checkout counter, right? So they don't know if you're spending $2,000 on duck decoys, $2,000 on guns, $2,000 on ammunition. They have no idea what you're buying. And the credit card processors have been very clear. They don't know. They don't want to know. They don't really care because that's not their job. If it's a legal transaction, they'll process it. And so it doesn't really tell Amalgamated or it doesn't do what Andrew Ross Sorkin thinks it does. But that's the concern. And in fact, after it passed, he had another piece in the New York Times, championing what ISO had done, and then said, now we got to go do the next steps, which is that an Amalgamated is working on this to develop an algorithm to identify what they would consider to be suspicious transactions. Right. If you don't know what somebody's buying, how in the world do you know whether it's suspicious or not?
So that seems to be a big flaw in this idea.
So how do you solve that? What comes next is pressure to allow the banks to see what's inside the basket. So you have an invasion of privacy, and then, you're buying one of those guns. No, that's suspicious. Or no, we're just not going to process that transaction. Or you're buying too much ammunition, or you're buying too many guns, or whatever the case will be that they decide is suspicious. And so then they will file suspicious activity reports with the Treasury Department. And that opens up a can of worms. What does Treasury do with that? Well, maybe they put you on terrorist watch list. Maybe they put you on the no-fly list. You have no idea. You have no way of getting off of that list. Or it's given to law enforcement or ATF, and then all of a sudden law enforcement shows up at your door and says, let's see what you purchased, even though you've done nothing wrong, even though you're exercising a constitutional right. So you have privacy issues, wrapped around the exercise of a fundamental constitutional right. It's very, very troubling. And sure, this push will not just stop at, okay, now we have a code. They want to see what you're buying so they can stop you from buying it.
Yeah, certainly. I think even going back to those 2018 stories, he's talking about these purchases that are made across multiple different accounts at multiple different retailers. and are for not just firearms, especially in the case, I believe, of the Parkland shooter. He lists in there things like, targets or magazines that he bought as being this overall amount of money that he spent on guns and, number of transactions over 2 months. And, when I look at these examples, I don't know that I see much of a pattern that's distinct from just normal gun buying by a normal person that millions of people do every year. I guess that's the core of this. Do you see any legitimacy in this idea that you could identify some sort of predictive pattern in gun purchasing that would help you catch a mass shooter or perhaps a gun trafficker? That has been the other.
I don't believe that you can, or that would be effective. Now, one, keep in mind retailers, who are making the sale, if they think something is suspicious, they can, as they do all the time, deny the sale and contact ATF or local law enforcement. That happens every day in this country, right? So the retailer's in a better position to make a judgment on that than some algorithm or somebody sitting at a computer terminal in some center in India or something going to decide whether it's suspicious or not. I don't know how you would decide that, particularly when you don't know what even a person's purchasing. Or if somebody goes shooting every weekend, they buy ammunition every weekend. That's very suspicious. I mean, it's just fraught with opportunities for abuse. And the credit card processors, particularly since ISO has adopted this, have sent letters to Senator Warren and others that have supported this to say, we will adopt the code because that's the standard, but this changes nothing. We don't see inside the basket. We don't want to see inside the basket. It's not our job. Now, also, credit card companies, banks already have a legal obligation to report to Treasury, to file a suspicious activity report if they see any activity that is suspicious. But this is in the context of fraud, like, Stephen's credit card, is always used in a certain geographic region because that's where he lives. And all of a sudden there's a transaction with this card in India. Well, that gives you something to say, wait a second, what's going on here? Stephen never goes to India, and that happens with people. If you're traveling, you might get a call from your credit card company saying, is this you? And that sort of thing. But just to look at purchases, a dollar amount, and say, well, this person bought something from a gun store. There must be something nefarious here. It's going to result in, and then what's going to happen? Law enforcement's going to get inundated with these suspicious activity reports. What are they going to do? Start knocking on your door or just ignore it? They don't see how it works. I don't think they truly understand how the process actually works. I mean, it does strike me as something of an idea that something of a New York Times idea, if that makes any sense. Happening.
Like
and
something.
So what do you see?
Something happening? Where they just don't have an understanding of how people actually buy guns in real life, and so they see. This mass shooter bought, a couple $1,000s worth of guns in 2 months. And that's shocking to them because they don't understand that a lot of people buy a couple $1,000s worth of guns in every couple of months. Like, it's not an uncommon thing to do. It's sort of this classic media misunderstanding when they're describing arsenals, right? And it's a couple hundred rounds of ammunition and like 5 guns. That is not an uncommon thing for just normal people to have.
And I will tell you, in having conversations with the credit card processors, several of them have indicated to us that they don't believe that Andrew or Sorkin or the politicians advocating for this understand how the system works, and that this is not going to do what they think unless it goes to these next steps where they can see inside the basket. Or start denying transactions, and the pressure will be applied to the issuing banks to start denying transactions.